Our text for this sermon and the next sermon will both be from Matthew chapter 5, part of what we call the Sermon on the Mount, and we'll be looking at verse 13 for the first lesson, and then verses 14 through 16 for the second lesson. Again, these are familiar texts to us as we consider these verses speaking of our influence in the world. Jesus will use the metaphors of both salt and light to talk about the influence that we as Christians are supposed to have on the world. Some have called this passage the shake and shine passage. That is, shake the salt, and that's this first lesson, and then shine the light. That's going to be our second lesson at the next hour. We know that God identifies His children in various ways in the Bible. He calls us sheep. He calls us children. He calls us little ones, brethren, and so forth. In the preceding verses to our text, we have what are called the Beatitudes. Blessed are thee, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers, and so forth. Those are the Beatitudes. And there Jesus identified His followers by having those qualities of peace, of mercy, of meekness, and so forth. Now, the verses that follow the Beatitudes, including our text, Jesus says that we are to live out these standards in our lives. That is, as we live out these standards, we make a difference for good in the world in which we live. And so, first of all, shake the salt. Matthew 5:13, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. So we think about salt in this study, and first of all, I think we all realize of our need for and of salt. We cannot live without salt. Some of you recall when Adam was a baby, he began to lose his birth weight and then some, and we were alarmed and took him to the doctors, and they discovered he had a potentially life-threatening disease called kidney reflux, and his sodium level had dropped dangerously low, and he was in critical condition there for a time. You don't want your sodium level, your salt level, if you will, to drop too low. And we're facing hot weather and high humidity, and we sweat a lot, obviously, and we lose a lot of sodium, and doctors tell us we need to replenish that if we're outside working a lot. Truth be told, though, in our culture, we eat way too much sodium and salt. Salt is in just about everything. We don't use the salt shaker a whole lot at our house because salt is in bread, salt is in drinks, salt is in processed food. The FDA tells us if you want a healthy level of sodium, you need no more than 2,300 milligrams. Unless you think that's a lot, I challenge you to keep up with that for a day, how much salt you intake, and it will astound you. We go way over the daily, most of us go way over the daily recommended allotment of sodium. But we need it. We need some salt, obviously, to live. Animals need it. When we were raising cows, we would often buy salt blocks and put out there for them to lick. That's how they would get the salt that they needed. Salt is a sustainer of life in other ways. The seawater, I'm told, will actually support more organisms than fresh water because of the qualities of salt. And so, shake the salt. You are Christians. We are the salt of the earth. Let's sort of break down this verse and look at it in three different points. You are the salt of the earth. We begin with number one, a description. Jesus describes us, His followers, as being the salt of the earth. Why would He call us salt? Well, for various reasons. Salt does a lot of things. Number one, salt, as we know, preserves. Salt preserves. It wards off rot and decay. People rub salt into meat in order to preserve that meat. I remember my granddad had a smokehouse out back of their house, and I was young, and I would go out there, and you'd open the door, and I mean there would be hams hanging, and I thought, how are those not ruining? Well, they were salted down and salted down. That's why processed foods contain so much sodium, to preserve that meat and that food. I love green olives, not off the tree. We went to Jerusalem and we ate green olives. They brought them on platters. They were right off the tree. I was expecting the red pimento and the salty taste, and I've been into one and they had the pit in there, and those weren't fitting to eat in my mind. I didn't eat any more olives over there. I like the one in a jar with a red pimento, and they have way too much sodium in there, but they seldom run out of date because of all the salt that's in there. Salt preserves, and who knows, as God's people, we may help preserve this old wicked world from destruction. You think about that, you think about Genesis 19 and Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot moving there. He shouldn't have made the move, and he regretted, no doubt, making that move, but hindsight's 20/20, as we say, so he lived there, and God said, get out. I've fed up with the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham got wind of that, and he intervened, tried to persuade God not to destroy the cities. And Abraham offered suggestions. If 45 good people are found in Sodom and Gomorrah, would you not spare the cities for sake of the 45? And God said, sure. And they kept bartering and got all the way down to 10. And God said, I will save the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah if you can find 10 good people there. 10 good people would have preserved Sodom and Gomorrah from destruction. But sad to say, 10 could not be found. We may wonder, with all the evil around us, and as rampant as it is, why hasn't God already destroyed the universe and mankind? Could it be because we as righteous people could have been like the 10, we are helping to preserve this world until it's finally ripe for destruction? I don't know that, but certainly that is a thought from Genesis, the 19th chapter. We're called salt because salt preserves. We're called salt because we know that salt penetrates. Now, when it comes to metal, salt and metal do not get along. I was always warned never to buy a car that came from up north, not because of an aversion to Yankees, but because of an aversion to rust. Up north, they get a lot of snow, put a lot of salt on the roads. That salt gets on cars. If that's not washed off, it can do a real number to body work on a car in a hurry. A lot of people are putting in saltwater pools in their backyards. And again, the long-term consequences of that could very well be a lot of rust and a lot of headaches in having that type of pool. But here we talk about salt penetrating. We're talking about us as God's people, the infiltrating ability we have in a good sense. You recall in Acts, the 8th chapter, after Stephen had been put to death, that the disciples were scattered. But instead of that being a bad thing, that was actually a good thing, because the further they went, the further the gospel message went. They infiltrated and penetrated other areas with the truth. And again, that was a blessing. It was said of Paul and his companions that they had turned the world upside down. Acts 17 and verse 6, because of the way they had infiltrated communities with the good news. And people were converting to Christ and leaving paganism. And again, that is a great thing. So we're called salt because salt preserves, it penetrates. We know that salt purifies. Salt purifies. It has a remarkable cleansing ability. You may recall from 2 Kings, the 2nd chapter, that Elisha cleansed the waters of Jericho with salt. We're told in ancient times newborn babies would be washed in salt to cleanse their bodies and to give their skin a certain amount of firmness. We know that salt in a wound can help cleanse the wound. When our cows got pink eye, we would throw a little salt in their eye and it would clear up in short time. And of course, if you have a sore throat, you know the wonderful benefits of gargling in warm or hot salt water. Salt purifies. Well, as Christians, we can have a purifying effect on the world around us. You may have had the experience, say, at work. You come upon people, they're talking, but they know you're a Christian. And immediately they drop the coarse language or the coarse jokes. And they do that simply because they know you don't appreciate that. You don't talk like that. You don't think like that. You don't want to hear those things. You've had a purifying effect, believe it or not, realize it or not, on that group of people because they know who you are, that you are a child of God. Salt purifies. We can be a purifying effect on this world. Salt pleases. We're called salt because salt pleases. Salt brings out the best. Salt blends and adds flavor to food. There are foods we probably can't imagine eating without salt. French fries, not much of a taste, right? Without salt. Tanya bought a huge bag of popcorn the other day. We were up Tennessee. I mean, that thing was this big. It was full of popcorn for $2.50. Now, that's a bargain. When we started eating that, there was not one grain of salt on that popcorn. Eating it anyway, but doesn't taste quite the same, right? Without a little bit of salt. Salt brings flavor. Well, as Christians, we ought to bring flavor in a good way to the world around us. We are to live our lives that we bring out the best in those around us. Jesus did that again and again. People could not help but be transformed by simply being with the Lord. And so our lives, of course, are to be lived as to be worthy of the gospel. Philippians 1:27. We are to have a pleasing effect on the world in which we live. We're called salt. We're the salt of the earth. In the next place, and this may not seem on the surface like a good thing because salt can poison. Salt can poison. Salt does kill some things. If you don't believe me, if you see a slug out in your yard, pour some salt in it and it will die. It will die quickly. If you want to kill your grass, pour salt on your grass. Too much salt isn't good for us. It raises our blood pressure, among other adverse health effects. In the Old Testament, Judge Abimelech decided he would teach a city a lesson. And he sowed the fields of that city with salt so that they would not grow and they would not have any produce. But in a good sense, think about this. When Christianity is sowed into our lives and our homes and our communities, some things will be put to death. Things like sin and evil. We can make an impact on our world by the very fact that Christianity is poison to sin and the devil. When Jesus comes into a person's life, things like drinking and cursing and fighting and hating and drugging and loose living and all those things are killed, are put to death. Paul says if we're Christians, we are to mortify or put to death those kinds of things. Christianity is pure poison to that which is evil and the devil himself. Another reason we're called salt. You're the salt of the earth. We're called salt because salt promotes. Salt creates a thirst for water if you're exposed to salt. One of the, seeming contradictions of being lost at sea is you get thirsty and you don't make the mistake of drinking the salt water. That only increases the problem. Salt creates thirst. It does not quench thirst, but it promotes a thirst for water. As Christians, we have opportunity then to promote thirst for the Lord in our world. Jesus said that He's the water of life, John chapter 6, and we are to try to make the world thirsty for the Lord. I'm not going to do that, though, if I'm guilty of hypocrisy, if I don't walk as I talk, if I don't do as I say. I want to, by my life, create an interest in folks out there, an interest in Jesus, a thirst for Jesus. And so, a description, you are the salt of the earth. If I'm God's person, God says I'm the salt of the earth. But there's a danger. And that danger is where Jesus says, if the salt loses its savor, the King James translation, or flavor, New King James translation, the meaning is the same. In Bible times, salt was very, very, valuable back then. In fact, it was so valuable then that Roman soldiers were often paid their wages not with coins, but with salt. And what they were paid was called a salarium. If you drop off the IUM and add the Y, you get the word salary. That's where our English word salary came from, where the Roman soldiers were paid with salt. Salarium, we get the English word salary. We also have the expression, he's not worth his salt. That comes from this practice, again, of paying somebody wages in salt. It was possible, of course, for salt to lose its flavor, its savor. Now, the salt they used then a bit different than the salt we use today. We use sodium chloride today. They derived their salt usually from the cliffs of the Dead Sea or the waters of the Dead Sea. Just very salty. Again, the lowest point on earth in elevation, and you've got the sun beaming down, evaporating the water and leaving the minerals behind, and thus the salt. Again, on our Bible Land trip, we went there, and we saw people get in the water. We were invited to get in the water, and some did, and you just float on the top, just about like laying on the floor. You can't sink. It's so salty. And that's where they would derive their salt from, but it was mixed with mineral or vegetable matter, and if that touched the earth or exposed to the elements, it could lose its salty taste. And of course, tasteless salt is no good, absolutely useless. It is possible for us as Christians to lose our saltiness, if you will, as well. That is, if we become worldly, we lose our taste. We lose our ability to penetrate the hearts of people with the good news, our ability to purify the world because we become impure ourselves. And so the ever-present need of guarding against worldliness. You've heard the illustration, as long as the boat is in the water, all is fine, but when water starts getting in the boat, you've got problems. And that's true of Christians. As long as we are in the world, that's fine. We have to live in the world, but when the world starts getting in us, then we have problems. And then our soul is in jeopardy. And so the danger of the salt losing its flavor, of our losing our ability to help others with the truth because we become unfaithful. And then, sad to say, a destiny for salt that is useless. It is good for nothing, as the Bible says, but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. In fact, in Bible times, I'm told, when salt lost its flavor, that's exactly what they did. They took it and they cast it into the footpaths. Flavorless salt was used then like we use gravel today. Its only purpose, if it lost its taste or flavor, it would still kill out the weeds that would grow in the path, and they could walk on the path without getting their feet in mud simply by walking on the salt. Literally, useless salt was trampled underfoot by men. That was its only use after it lost its flavor. Well, the point's obvious. When we as Christians, as God's people, stop living like Christians and stop following the Lord's example and stop living for the Lord, spiritually speaking, we have become good for nothing in the eyes of God. Unless we make a complete turnaround, our soul and our salvation are indeed in jeopardy. The harm of both our hypocrisy toward those around us who think we're Christians and know we're not, and then our own eventual condemnation because we become unfaithful. The good news is I can get my saltiness back. I can regain my flavor, if you will, if as an erring child of God, I simply return to the Lord. Jesus' blood, the Bible says, can cleanse me of every sin, and people can pray for me. And I can once again be the person I ought to be, and I can be the person that Jesus can say truthfully that you are the salt. You're the salt of the earth. Now, if I'm not a child of God to begin with, I want to become one through faith in the Lord, through repenting of my sins, confessing my Lord, and being baptized. That makes me a new creation. That makes me the salt of the earth. So the next time, if you use a salt shaker, the next time you use one, just think about this. And remember our spiritual responsibilities then as Christians. That salt pours forth. Our influence and example also pours forth before the lives of others we associate with. And by our example and by our influence, we might just lead somebody to becoming a New Testament Christian. But if we again don't live as we say we live, that's a certain and real turnoff. And we don't want to be guilty of that. So may we, by our influence as the salt of the earth, impact the world in which we live for good in every way. You're the salt of the earth. Next lesson, we want to shine the light. But for now, if you need to respond, do so as we stand and as we sing.